And the response was, the wrong people are getting the word about freedom and democracy. The wrong people are hearing this revolutionary language and thinking that it applies to them. So this was the journey that I was on to hear and to get into this milieu of how frightening, how dangerous Black people were seen as, and then to follow it all the way through to the 21st century by looking at, do Black people have the right to bear arms? Do they have the right to a well-regulated militia? Do they have the right to self-defense? And seeing how in each of those it has been used against Black people. And that the legal status of Black folk has not altered that significantly. So whether enslaved, whether free Black, whether denizen, which was that halfway limbo land between enslaved and citizen, whether newly emancipated freed people, whether Jim Crow Black, or whether post-civil rights African American, the right to bear arms, the right to a well-regulated militia, and the right to self-defense are in fact fractured. That citizenship is fractured. It is hobbled by this intense anti-Blackness, this fear of Black people, this sense of Black people as a danger to white American society.
So, Professor Anderson, could you talk about that? In particular, the role of Black militias, which you talk about in the book, their role in the early 19th century, to what use they were deployed, and then how it is that whites stripped Black militias of their official standing.
Yes, and so in Louisiana, when it was still the Louisiana Territory, it was before the U.S. had purchased it, but it was on its way. It was on its way. You had a well-heeled, well-trained Black militia that had been very effective. Well, as the U.S. came in, one of the first cries coming out of white New Orleans was to strip the Black militia, disband the Black militia. Well, the governor, William Claiborne, at the time, at first he's like, yes, asking for more arms because we have all of these free Blacks and we've got these Black folks with arms. And so he's asking for more arms from the federal government. But then he starts noticing how effective this Black militia is. And so he tries to square the circle. White fear and the sense that the Black militia is the only real effective fighting force there, given all of the challenges that are happening in that territory at the time. And so what he comes up with is to remove the Black officer class from this Black militia and put in white officers, thinking that that will be enough for whites in New Orleans who want the Black militia disbanded. But then there is a massive, massive slave revolt coming from Charles Deslandes. And this massive slave revolt that included somewhere between 150 to 500 people headed to New Orleans, headed to what they believed was freedom, just sent terror through what is called the German coast of Louisiana. And so William Claiborne, seeing this massive movement, this massive slave revolt, in fact, begins to enlist the Black militia as part of the forces to take on this slave revolt. And the slave revolt is crushed. The U.S. Army comes in, the U.S. Navy comes in. You have the white militia that is there, but the Black militia is very effective. And so you have a Black militia fighting against Black folk who are enslaved and trying to be free. The reward that the Black militia received for this was a further push to be disbanded, further push to not have access to be able to purchase arms. They put a law in place that folks of color, Black people, could not buy arms. Then came the War of 1812, and Andrew Jackson is the leader, the military leader, and he sees the British coming in this Battle of New Orleans. And he sees this black militia and he's telling Claiborne, we need them. This is an effective fighting force. And Claiborne's like, yes, they are, but I'm telling you, they're just not feeling it right now because of the way we treat them. And he's like, I will treat them equally. I will treat them with the honor that all soldiers should have, and they will be paid equal to whites. They will receive the same pay. And besides the black militia, I want 2 additional battalions. Claiborne came back and said, you can get the black militia, but getting 2 additional battalions is going to be difficult because whites in this area believe that arming them is arming the enemy. So you have black folks who are identified as the enemy. And in that fighting force, that force beat the British. It was like 3,000 or so of Andrew Jackson's troops against 8,000 British troops, and they won. And Andrew Jackson was like, wow, I knew you guys were good. I just didn't know how good. But the response, the reaction to that then was to send them off as a labor battalion to work in the swamps that white men didn't want to go into to do the work. So you have this denigration of black military contributions to fighting for America. And that was a consistent theme that we saw. So you get this erasure of this history, and this erasure for the men themselves who are doing the fighting, who are being wounded, who are dealing with the loss of their fighting brethren. That has been the sense that black men under arms, they're a threat. And black men who are trained how to use arms, they're really a threat. So they must be disarmed after they have served our purpose.
Professor Anderson, I just wanted to follow up on the term you used, anti-blackness, that you're actually saying that the Second Amendment is not about guns, but it's about anti-blackness. Explain.
Yes, it is about the fear. So, and the best way to do this is to talk about the kind of history that we have about the Second Amendment. We hear the history of the militia about being this really effective fighting force to fend off a foreign invasion and also being there to fend off domestic tyranny. But what they knew at the time was that the militia had proven to be uneven, unreliable in the war of independence, the war for independence. George Washington was beside himself at the lack of reliability of the militias. Sometimes they would show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would just take off and run away. It's really difficult to form a battle plan when your fighting force is like, I'm not feeling it today. And it led Gouverneur Morris, who is out of New York and one of the founding fathers, to say to rely upon the militia against a foreign invasion is like to depend upon a broken reed. And so they knew that the militia was really not strong against a professional army. And then there was Shays' Rebellion. What they saw with Shays' Rebellion is that you could not really rely upon the militia in order to deal with an uprising and insurrections against government. You could not rely upon them for that. Where the militia was consistently good was in slave revolts, in crushing slave revolts. And so this is what led George Mason and Patrick Henry to talk about, we must control our militia. We will be left defenseless against its slave revolts if the federal government controls it. And so it is that fear of slave revolts, that fear of Black rebellion, this fear of Blacks as a dangerous population that must be controlled by these militias. That was essential in the drafting of the Second Amendment. When you think about the Bill of Rights.
I believe by now you know the Black American professor, Carol Anderson, right? Well, she brings about a very, very powerful argument, I can argue so, whereby she's saying that the administration that is currently in the United States of America, the Trump administration under the Republican Party, is suffering some challenges, right? And before I dive deep into what these challenges are, I need to remind you of something, and that is you see, when a man is beaten by a snake, right? When a man is beaten by a snake, they always be afraid even of a lizard, right? So this reduces their fear threshold to such a small level. Imagine how different a lizard is from a snake, right? So this lady, she's trying to explain to us that Black people in America, there was a time that they revolted. There's a time that they said, we don't want no more of this oppression. And this was very much early back then, right? And we had Northern America and Southern America, right? Not in terms of continent, but the entirety of the United States. We had the North region and the South region, right? The Southerners were people who are so much into the business of enslaving Black people. They took Black people as slaves, while the Northerners are people who had done away with this slavery thing, right? And so they were trying to liberate the whole of the United States of America because the South was still part of the USA. And with the help of white individuals such as John Brown, I did a video about John Brown. We saw that Black people were able to revolt against systemic oppression, systemic slavery, forced labor. And so that what happened during the American Civil War was very, very impactful, and it went down to history as something that should never ever be repeated in any government, right? So from that time henceforth, we've had governments, we've had things happen to try and reinforce the idea that was placed before to try and stop, or rather to try and um, you know, prevent an occurrence of such, right? So do not be surprised that what Trump is doing right now is just doing what his predecessors wanted, or what his masters really want of him to do, right? Trump's administration has even more racism than we ever thought. Trump's deportation policy has given a lot of power to the racist people. It has given a lot of power to the people who hate immigrants, right? Right now, walking and doing evil in the United States is casual, right? A Black person can be done anything. It's casual. Right now, it's not even Black people. We have the Latinas, we have the Mexicans, we have the Indians, we have the Asians, right? All those people are suffering, and they're suffering because they're immigrants. They are people who are different from the rest of the population, right? But there is a reason to it, and there is a mechanics to it. And so in this video, Carol Anderson is going to narrate, or rather she's going to explain to us the mechanics of this evil scheme, right? So without further ado, let's listen to her. By the end of the video, I shall share with you my thoughts, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis. Let's dive in.
Teach.
Thank you. This emerged out of the fear of Black people from slavery, that there was this massive fear about these slave revolts, Black people demanding their freedom, being willing to have an uprising to gain their freedom. And what that meant then was that you had this language of, we've got to keep this ferocious monster in chains. And you saw with each revolt, with each uprising, a series of statutes being put in place to say that African American, that the enslaved, that Black people could not own weapons, that they could not have access to weapons. And you also saw the rise and the structure of slave patrols and militias that were there and designed to contain that Black population. as the nation began to develop, as you had this war of independence, there was this fear of arming Black people, the fear that even free Blacks who were armed would provide a kind of sense of what freedom looked like to the enslaved. But the exigencies of war required that arming, required having Black folks in the Continental Army. But as the nation developed after that war, one of the things that you had happening was with the Constitution, with the drafting of the Constitution, because the militias themselves had proven so untrustworthy, unreliable as a force to fight against the British invasion, that James Madison, in drafting the Constitution, had language in there that you would have federal control of the militias. Well, when the Constitution went up for ratification to the states, by the time it got to Virginia, the Anti-Federalists in Virginia were in an uproar. George Mason and Patrick Henry were thinking about this militia being under the control of the federal government. They were like, we will be left defenseless. We cannot trust the federal government that has these folks from Pennsylvania and these folks from Massachusetts to be willing to engage the militia when the slaves revolt. We cannot trust the federal government to protect us. We will be left defenseless. And they began to demand a Bill of Rights that would provide protection, that would curtail federal power. And they began to demand as well a new constitutional convention. That threat of what that meant sent James Madison into the first Congress determined to write a Bill of Rights that would quell that dissent, that would short circuit that movement for a new constitutional convention. And we've already seen what the power of the South has meant in terms of when the Constitution was being drafted itself, how the South said that we will not sign on to become part of this United States of America if we don't get the 3/5 clause, if we don't get 20 additional years on the Atlantic slave trade, if we don't get a fugitive slave clause. And so the South had already wielded its power in terms of being willing to scuttle the United States of America. And Madison believed strongly that this threat coming out of the Anti-Federalists in the South, out of Virginia, would do the same thing. And that becomes the basis for this Second Amendment.
And can you talk about all of the players? I mean, you just mentioned James Madison, Patrick Henry, the slave states, and how this country came together based on this terror of slaves rebelling.
Yes,
enslaved people rebelling.
Yeah, the enslaved people rebelling, and that fear that, so you have George Washington, who is a slave owner, who brings, in fact, some of his enslaved people to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. You have Thomas Jefferson, who is not there, but he is writing in to Madison, and Madison is writing to him. And one of the things that Jefferson is concerned about is slavery, is the way that it will be depicted. And so you have this silence. There is a silence in the Constitution. It's hovering over the formation of the Constitution, like Banquo's ghost, haunting it, in shaping it, but not being explicitly said. But it is the power that is creating this sophistry, this really weird, we believe in freedom and equality, but we want 20 additional years on the Atlantic slave trade. What they said in South Carolina was that South Carolina would be just a backward place. Our wealth comes from the Negroes. That is our natural resource, and we must protect it at all cost. So this is what is the part of the tectonic plates moving at this time in this founding of this nation.
Professor Anderson, could you also explain the significance of the Uniform Militia Act of 1792 and its role in ensuring that weapons and guns remained in the hands of white people?
Yes, and so one of the first laws passed by Congress was the Uniform Militia Act of 1792. What it said was that all able-bodied white men between the ages of 18 and 45 would have to be part of the militia. And so here in the law, it is specifying white men. And it said that they must own a gun. This is part of, the militia is part of citizenship. It is how you give your service to the nation, how you provide your bona fides, as it were, as an American citizen. And so white men are the definition of American citizen in this framing, and that they must own a gun. And so what you see here is that the militia is given this high status in terms of what it means to be able to control an unruly population, what is seen as a dangerous population. And
Professor Anderson,
interestingly enough for me is that we have had a Shays Rebellion that happened right before the Constitutional Convention, where white men gathered together to attack the government because they didn't like a taxation policy, and that the militia would not put down these white men. In fact, you had members of the militia joining this rebellion. And you had to have Boston merchants basically finance a mercenary army to put down Shays Rebellion. But what you didn't see coming out of that was a law saying, you know, white men with arms are dangerous. White men with arms attack the government. So we need to ban white men from having access to weapons. You don't see that happening, but you do see that happening with slave revolts. You see the language, the laws coming in place saying they shall not have access, Black people shall not have access to weapons, and that the militia and the slave patrol are there to ensure that Black people do not have access to weapons.
And Professor Anderson, it seems, I mean, you begin your book by talking about the police murders of Philando Castile as well as Alton Sterling. And you point out that the NRA did not come to their defense, despite the fact that they were also killed for having guns in their possession, whereas in a comparable violence perpetrated by whites, mass violence, the NRA immediately leapt to the defense of the people responsible for that violence, who were white men.
Absolutely. And so there was a basic silence on Philando Castile. There was nothing said about Alton Sterling. And what was said about Philando Castile from the NRA was, and this was only after being pushed by their African-American members, was that we believe that everyone, regardless of race, sexual orientation, should have access to guns, to arms. But nothing really substantive. What happened after Ruby Ridge and Waco, Texas, with the Branch Davidian, was that Wayne LaPierre called out federal officers as being jackbooted government thugs who believe they have the right to storm into people's homes and take their guns and kill law-abiding citizens. Federal officers had been killed in those events. And so to then label the response as jackbooted thugs when you get silence with Philando Castile it really led me to, as journalists were asking, don't African Americans have Second Amendment rights? And that's what sent me down this path all the way to the 17th century to be able to answer that question.
So let's go back to 2016. And this you write in your book, Carol Anderson, about how thus inspired you to write this whole book. The immediate aftermath of the police shooting of Philando Castile was broadcast live on Facebook by his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, who's speaking in the car next to her dying boyfriend as a police officer continues to point the gun into the car. Her little child is in the back seat. A warning to our viewers, the content is deeply disturbing.
They killed my boyfriend. He's licensed. He's licensed to carry. He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket, and he let the officer know that he had a firearm and he was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm.
So dashcam video released nearly a year later shows the 4-year-old daughter of Diamond Reynolds consoling her heartbroken mother, who's handcuffed in the back of a police squad car minutes after the St. Anthony police officer, Geronimo Yanez, shot and killed Philando.
Mom, please help too, because I'm screaming because I don't want you to get shooted. Okay, give me a kiss. My phone just died, that's all. I can keep her safe. It's okay, I got it, okay? Come here. I can't believe they just did that.
There we hear the crying of Diamond's daughter. The video was released just days after the police officer, Geronimo Yanez, was acquitted of manslaughter. I wanted to ask you, Carol Anderson, to take us on that journey that you took, experiencing all of this, taking it in, telling us who Philando was, talking about the fact that he had a gun, legally had a gun, and told the police officer about it. In fact, had told his mother before, I'm thinking of not carrying the gun, though it's legal, because of, well, I mean, just the day before, another African-American man, Alton Sterling, had been killed by police in Louisiana. But you take us on this journey that led to this book.
Yes, and so it was the killing of Philando Castile. I start off the book going, it was like a snuff film, because we all saw that video image, and it was horrific. It was jarring. And to then get the backstory that this was a man who followed NRA guidelines, letting the officer know that I have a licensed carry weapon with me. You have asked for my ID. I am reaching for my ID. And the officer begins to shoot. So he is killed because he has a weapon. Not that he is brandishing the weapon, not that he is threatening anyone. He simply has a weapon. And that really led me to begin on this journey, as I saw the NRA's virtual silence on this journey to figure out, do African Americans have Second Amendment rights? We're in this moment where the Second Amendment is like hallowed ground. It is sacred. It is one of those things that has been defined as the bedrock of citizenship. And so I started looking. And as I went on this journey, what I saw was that it wasn't about guns. It was about the fear of Black people. It was about the fear of Blackness. It was about the societal labeling of Black people as dangerous, as a threat to whites, and that this architecture comes in place in order to contain this Black population, in order to provide security and safety to the white community from this fear of Black people. And you get this really weird matrix happening where Black people are feared but needed. And so it is the how do we contain them? How do we snuff out their quest for freedom? How do we snuff out their quest for their basic human rights while also keeping them as labor without rights? How do we do that? How do we make that subjugation happen? How do we talk about in this land of the United States of America? How do we talk about freedom, but try to keep it contained from this Black population? We don't want them getting the ether that we're talking about in this revolutionary moment about freedom and democracy and justice. We don't want them hearing the words about equality. How do we do that? And when there was a revolt in Virginia in 1800 with Gabriel, and Gabriel had fed on the language, the revolutionary language from the United States, from the French Revolution, and from the Haitian Revolution. That sent shockwaves throughout the United States. And Virginia was trembling at the expansiveness of Gabriel's revolt.
So after watching this video, here's my deep critical analysis. You see, Professor Carol Anderson works at the Emory University, and she's an acclaimed author as well. So she provided a compelling critique of modern threats to American democracy, especially the legacy of voter suppression and political violence targeting Black people and the marginalized communities in the United States of America. Her insights resonate not only with the historical lessons, but with the sense of urgency for today's civil life. See, Dr. Carol Anderson, or rather Professor Carol Anderson, tries to tell us that there is a threat to American democracy. Anderson, as you've seen, was featured in response to Professor, or rather to the President. Anderson was featured in response to former President Donald Trump's indictment for attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election, right? Now, in this broadcast, she highlights how Trump's legal charges, particularly the conspiracy against voting rights, how it mirrors tactics historically used to disenfranchise African Americans during Reconstruction. According to Carol Anderson, the big lie about widespread voter fraud was intentionally aimed at delegitimizing votes from Black and other minor communities, echoing suppression campaigns of the past. You know? So one thing that she also discussed was in Georgia. Georgia was the battleground of democracy. A particular focus of Carol Anderson was the county of Georgia, which appeared 48 times in Donald Trump's federal indictment. She explained how pressure tactics from Trump's infamous call to Secretary of State Brad, the name is so hard, I'm not going to name it. She explained how the Secretary Brad was trying to fabricate and alternate electoral slates, which were designed to nullify Black majority votes in a pivotal swing slate. Carol Anderson emphasized the true weight of the Georgia's 2020 electorate, noting that 90% of Black voters and large majorities of Hispanics and Asian American voters supported Sleepy Joe. Attempts to override these votes, she asserted, amounted to the invalidating the will of the majority of voters in those communities, right? So we also had the role of intimidation and violence. Carol Anderson, as you've seen, she also has explained, or rather she's drawn parallels between contemporary electoral interference and Reconstruction, right? She shared details of aggressive rhetorics from figures in Trump's circles, such as discussions of drumming up riots or invoking the Insurrection Act, underlining a willingness to use force to suppress democratic expression. Carol Anderson also has recounted how election workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, two black women in Fulton County, became targets of death threats after Rudy Giuliani falsely accused them of vote manipulation and drug-like activities. These clarifications, including Giuliani's later admission that the allegations were false, illustrate how lies can fuel political terror and systematic disenfranchisement, right? So she also talked about the Triple K clan, right? She has framed contemporary assaults on voting rights as ideological extension of the terror that precipitated the KK clan, right? Which passed during Reconstruction to protect Black Americans' political participation. She argues that the intimidation tactics faced by Black voters and poll workers today reflect patterns that Congress once sought to address legally. And one of Anderson's warning was about the legacy of policy consequences and the spreading of fraudulent claims. The false rhetoric became the basis for new voter suppression laws, right? Laws like the Georgia's SB 202 drastically reduced drop box availability in majority Black communities, curtailing access to voting and reinforcing systemic barriers and under the guise of preventing fraud, right? So despite these troubling dynamics, Professor Carol Anderson conveyed a message of empowerment. If the rule of law holds and citizens mobilize through registration and voting, democracy can prevail, right? She underscores the political stakes of fathoming, or rather forthcoming trials and the capacity of voters to shape outcomes, especially in states targeting state-level prosecutions beyond, or rather beyond, federal pardons, right? It's true, when the voice of the people really matter, then change is guaranteed. But if the voice of the people do not matter, change is just but a myth, right? So Dr. Carol Anderson, or Professor Carol Anderson, in this interview, which was held at a channel called Democracy Now, the discussions wove together historical insight and contemporary critique, right? Carol Anderson portrays today's attacks on voting rights and election legitimacy not as isolated crises, but as continuation of a long arc of racialized political suppression. By anchoring her analysis in specific legal action, electoral outcomes, and acts of intimidation, she illuminated how democratic erosion today echoes America's past, and why safeguarding voting access remains central to the promise of the Republic, right? Yeah. So, guys, democracy in America is not as real as they try and make it seem, right? Democracy is when it is by the people, for the people, and with the people. These are the words of Abraham Lincoln, a person who I believe was a man who was tough, a man who was a strong man, right? The man who was up there to ensure that America was moving forward, not burdened backwards by the burdens of racism, the burdens of racial superiority, right? And when I say racial superiority, I mean white supremacy, right? There's no race which Abraham Lincoln thought was greater than the other. People came together and built America. Black Americans built America. America belonged to the Red Indians, and now it hosts all these people together. And America cannot say that they are taking democracy to other countries while where they themselves are not part of the democratic practice, right? You see, before you clean your brother's house, I think you should clean your house first. And when that is done, things will be much better than before. Yes. This is EFK Original Documentaries. If you like what I do, subscribe. I'll surely appreciate. See you in the next one, and kindly stay positive.